Hello and welcome back to Module 9b for Ethics and Society, where we're going to look at the social contract theories of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and John Stuart Mill. And just to let you know, no, there's not a drone flying around my living room. My next door neighbor just decided to mow his lawn, so we'll have to bear with that for a few minutes. He just finished. Okay, he must have heard me. Okay, so we're going to look at Jean-Jacques Rousseau's social contract that really builds upon Locke's ideas that we presented in the previous module. So not a huge difference, but some substantial ones that were particularly French. And those changes and those modifications actually helped to lay further foundation for the French Revolution. So that's kind of important. Okay, so Jean-Jacques Rousseau was actually Swiss, so it wasn't French, but as we've mentioned now a number of times, very strongly influenced by Locke's two treatises of government, and sort of Locke's more enlightened, more progressive view of human beings. And both Locke and Rousseau themselves did really strongly influence the French Enlightenment, especially in terms of its political philosophy. And so for Rousseau, his greatest contribution was his notion of political theory as egalitarian, based on equality. That's what that means. A sort of a different distribution of power. In fact, very serious issues relating to political power and how it should be wielded. But he essentially gave us modern political thought because I believe, as I mentioned last week, the democratic systems that we have in North America, for example, are founded on ideas presented by Locke and by Rousseau together. So they are still very much relevant. Okay, so the social contract, and of course I forgot to grab my copy, but trust me, it's back there with all those books. The social contract is broken down into sort of four sections. And the first book talks about the notion of a civil society and the main characteristics of that society. And I mentioned with Locke that civil society is sort of the economic realm, right? The interactive and economic realm of a society where economic exchange is occurring. People are getting jobs, are purchasing products, are fulfilling mandates that they have engaged with other people in terms of contractual obligations to work, to own things, to pay rent and so on. That's all kind of civil society. Also kind of in brackets, you could say middle class. It's a day-to-day operations of a society. That's essentially what that is. Book 2 talks about the nature and functions of a sovereign body and an effective one for a proper functioning of a civil society. And these are the rules and regulations that come together to create a more equal form of civil interaction. And of course, when we say civil, it's a pretty word for saying economic interaction. Book 3 discusses government, and Book 3 is where we get some ideas that we're going to look at today, as well as Book 1. But Book 3 talks about government, its place in the state and forms of governments, the power relationships, the distributions of power, and most important, limits of power. This is what Rousseau was known for, the limits of governmental power. This is really the difference between Rousseau and Locke, and very clearly the difference between Locke/Rousseau and Hobbes. Hobbes, power is absolute. The monarchy and the aristocracy are absolute. For Rousseau, absolutely not. And it is the limits of political power that put the idea into the French population's heads that perhaps there was a way around it. And as much pushing back as was required, to the point of overthrowing that monarchy and effectively ending it. Because after the French Revolution, there is no more monarchy. The French monarchy is gone. And in fact, a substantial amount of the clergy that supported the monarchy are gone as well. Lots of beheadings. So that is Book 3, and Book 4 talks about further issues about the form and organization of a just society. But it's mostly in this area here that we are going to discuss some of the ideas that Rousseau is presenting to us. So looks a lot like Locke's ideas about the social contract. In particular, as more important, is the state of nature. But Rousseau takes it a little bit further. He says, look, individuals originally lived in a state of nature in complete freedom. Locke calls it perfect freedom, perfect because it's reasonable. And for Rousseau, it's complete freedom. They were not subject to authority, not subject to laws. And yet Rousseau believed that individuals still got along with one another. And that's what made it so beautiful, right? So complete. And what eventually happens, and Rousseau isn't clear on how this works out, but we go from a state of complete freedom to a position where the self-preservation of ourselves and our freedoms become more difficult. Now, here's where he's like Locke. So he says, okay, individuals make a pact, right? They decide, they make a compact with each other to forfeit that natural liberty, that perfect freedom, that complete freedom, the natural rights that they have. Because again, a state of nature for Locke and Rousseau looks very different than it does for Hobbes. For Hobbes, it's a bloodbath, right? It's war of all against all. For Locke and now Rousseau, it is a kind of natural liberty that everybody just kind of gets along, right? Everybody has some stuff. Everybody isn't looking out for, prestige and power and wealth and influence. No, it's a state of nature. It's a community that gets along. So civil authority arises out of, right? It is generated out of this social contract. But, and here's where the difference is with Locke and Rousseau. For Rousseau, right, yes, we have complete freedom. We have natural liberties. But he also says that even with that civil authority, force does not give government moral authority. And this is the part that people read and go, oh, okay, I'm getting crushed by the monarchy, and Louis XVI wants everything, including my firstborn and secondborn. There's got to be a better way. So it's these kinds of ideas that Rousseau is putting in people's heads, that they had perfect freedom. Of course, you want to go back to that, but you can't, right? You've got to live in society. So how can we recreate that? How can we have the same freedoms? And of course, one of the greatest obstacles towards that perfect freedom, that complete freedom, is the monarchy and the church that stand in the way of people being able to live happily and live freely. But Rousseau clearly defines that in terms of the limits of political power, and specifically the fact that just because you are a government does not give you the mandate to force yourself upon people. And of course, why is that important? Well, because in classical natural law, we talked about that natural right? The natural right to be free. Anything that is an obstacle to that is considered bad. You can still create laws that will support and entrench and make freedom more robust, but anything that stands in the way of that kind of freedom is considered to be a negative aspect of that social contract and a negative aspect of just life in general. So with classical natural law, right, it's kind of reformulated and rebuilt. And then these new theories end up being laid down, right, being posited, and in this case, humanly derived rules of conduct. It is based on society, not based on religion. What makes a good society? Is it a group of people that pray and obey and go to church every Sunday, or people that get along with one another? That's essentially what Locke and Rousseau are positing to people. So they say, look, with Rousseau, right, this development leads to the conclusion that the formal principle of reason would replace this material principle based on nature or God. Now, here it's primarily God because we're still talking about natural law. But what we were talking about, though, are laws posited by individuals. And of course, we would want to have a say in what we consider to be important. And at this point, right, this is before democracies, this is before freer governments. Rousseau is writing basically under the shadow of the monarchy and the clergy and saying, no, we need to have formal principles and standards that are social, not religious, because the religious ones are the ones that are crushing us. And Rousseau, again, he was still a Christian, he was still a believer, but I want to make it very clear here. We're talking about the institution of religion, the Catholic Church, not doctrine, not ideas about religion, but the institution, right? The institution was crushing individuals and basically asking them to give up everything, to constantly be giving money to the church because, of course, they were so poor, despite the fact that they drive by in a gold-plated, cart or something. But I digress. The point is, Rousseau wishes to use social principles, formal, reasonable principles built on utility, rather than principles built on religion, to create a better world. And that's essentially what Rousseau is asking us to consider. So his social contract, not unlike Locke's, talks about the relationship of individuals in very similar ways. He talks about the social contract creating a body politic. That is, again, the people of a nation, of a state, of a community, however you wish to define the body politic. And you can have a body politic in London, Ontario, Canada, the Western Hemisphere. And of course, the bigger it gets. But of course, the further out you go, you're going to start seeing regional differences and community differences. Generally speaking, for right now, the body politic is the community under which these individuals live according to certain laws that they believe in. So that's the body politic. And they are brought together and organized, and under the sovereignty, which is a self-governing state, right? Citizens are organized under state laws. Legally, the citizen is known as a subject because you are subject under the law. And the sovereign, right, whether this is a supreme ruler or monarch, may occasionally use force to ensure that citizen subjects follow the general will, right? The will of the people as a whole. So there's something interesting that's going on here. Instead of having an absolute monarchy or an absolute monarch, a king that is all powerful, we have a different distribution of power. And Rousseau would like to argue that power ultimately comes from the people, right? It's literally the opposite of Hobbes. Power comes from the people. People have the power. And they do, and it is expressed through what Rousseau calls the general will, la volonté générale. That's what the general will is. It's what the majority of people want. It's the majority of what the body politic wants. And so this is how he looks at the way that power is distributed between government officials, a monarchy if there happens to be one. Remember, he's writing at the time when King Louis XVI is still around and very, very powerful. But that general will is really quite different from what we see in Locke, and most definitely does not exist in Hobbes, because the general will is the way in which that common good, that public usefulness, public utility is expressed. It becomes a collective decision. For example, a vote. A vote is a part of the general will. Whatever Republicans may be saying right now for this week. But in this case, the general will can be expressed through a vote. And that's usually one of the best ways to do it. There will be a referendum on something. We're going to take a vote on something. That's the expression of the general will. That means the majority of people believe this. And Rousseau thought that this was an excellent way to make sure that power is evenly distributed, that we have a say. And the way in which we do it is through this general will. So the social contract breaks with nature through this new principle. It now follows the social rather than the natural. So you now have what were natural rights becoming social rights. It is about the construction and maintenance and perpetuation of society rather than the perpetuation of some theological doctrine, for example. And notions of justice, for example, become important. They become legal terms, right? Because here it isn't sort of justice in a biblical sense or in a philosophical sense, but in a legal sense, right? That it should be, it should be viewed as a legal recourse. But no matter what, right, it is always an expression of the general will that the laws exist in the state that they do. That we reserve the right to push back, to disagree with the law, and we need to go out and we need to let our governments know. So the situation which every citizen subject totally gives his or her so-called natural right over to the community sums up the conditions under which only those regulations count as legitimate which express a common interest. So the only legitimate interests are in fact the common interests. And what this means is, well, let's say a lobby group, right? Here's a lobby group of let's say oil executives, who are really upset over, regulations from the environment, let's say, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency in the US, or the Canadian government. And they're really, really mad that, these laws are going to stop them from either fracking or which is natural gas, or oil explorations in pristine lands, that has been owned by the government and it's off limits. So they start to lobby and they start to change laws. This would drive Rousseau nuts, because that's not the general will. That is particular wills, in particular individuals that believe that they have their voices should be heard over and above others. Rousseau says no. That general will needs to be the consensus of as many people as possible. So the fiction of a state of nature also had the meaning of specifying the conditions under which an agreement would express the common interest of all involved, and to that extent it would count as rational. It is rational because it is reasonably posited by individuals. Everyone agrees to it. And if there is agreement, there is consensus. If there is consensus, it's likely valid. It would be difficult for a society to have a general will of, hey, we should have a purge every day. It sounds insane, right? It sounds, at the very least, unreasonable. So this, this move into the social contract from the state of nature includes the ability of that community to speak up and to help formulate laws, help to formulate the distribution of power. So this is Rousseau. Now, this is only book 1, chapter 6. So a little bit of 4, a little bit of 1. Book 3. But these ideas are really inherent in the entire book. These sort of kind of the main points. But he says in book 1, chapter 6, for if each gives himself over completely, the situation is the same for all. And if the situation is the same for all, no one has an interest in making it difficult for others. Because what harms one harms everyone. And when you have a lobby group, that's the specific or particular interests of only certain individuals over and above everyone else. And that is just not the way to run a society, at least not a fair society. So Locke also believes that the social contract is a natural evolutionary step. It is a good thing. And he says, look, the social contract becomes necessary because we have these issues in the state of nature that we cannot resolve without that third party. And the way in which we can do that is we, first of all, right, we need to aggregate our forces and we need to act in harmony. Our general will needs to be in harmony with our needs and desires and our requirements. It also should also be in harmony with the greater powers that will be able to bring into law the corrections and the solutions that we offer through the general will. But before any of that can happen, we need to come together as one body politic. We need to all speak essentially the same voice. And this is what Rousseau is saying. Now, there's also, and this is where it becomes important, as much as we need a body politic that expresses their views and their needs and their longings and desires and so on, as one voice to the general will, there's also very clearly defined limits of power. So Rousseau, and this again, this is where individuals living in France reading Rousseau perhaps for the first time really began to think about, like, why can't force create right? Right? That's not the way it works. Just because, might makes right, I just come along with more goons, more than you have, and then we're back to square one, right? Just another bloodbath. Now, this idea of why can't force create right is actually an ancient idea. It actually appears in the Georgics by Plato. And just read what Plato says, because it sounds an awful lot like what Rousseau is talking about. So this is, I believe, Socrates saying these particular lines. In my opinion, those who frame the laws are the weaker folk, the majority. So the weaker folk are the majority, not the particular individuals. And accordingly, they frame the laws for themselves and for their own advantage, and to prevent the stronger who are able to overreach them from gaining the advantage over them. There's Plato writing in 430 BC, let's say, more or less. We're not exactly sure, but let's say around 400 BC. So we're talking a long time, almost 2,000 years prior. And Rousseau raises the same point. Why can't force create right? because it's force, right? That's exactly what's going on here. So we cannot accept something that is forced upon us. We need to agree to it. Because if you are coerced or threatened, then morality goes out the window. And we'll see that very, very shortly. So this is how Rousseau looks at it, that the majority of individuals are actually in a weaker position. So they wish to have those laws entrenched because ultimately it protects them. It protects the majority of people. Sure, there are always going to be wealthy people, obscenely wealthy people, and so on. But those individuals have ways of taking care of themselves that the majority of us don't, right? That they can buy off a problem, right? They can hire an army of lawyers to do all kinds of things. Most of us can't. So, to get back to Rousseau, what do individuals gain from accepting a social contract? Well, self-preservation, right, is one. And so all the forces that we didn't have at work in the state of nature to protect us, right, self-preservation, now gets entrenched in this legal and political system that works for us. It works to our advantage, not that it is over and above somebody else. It keeps the others in check. We now have legal forces that protect us and our self-preservation that we wouldn't have otherwise in that state of nature. So the sum of forces arises when several persons come together, form an association, a compact, and that will defend and protect private property as well as allow each member to obey only themselves. Now again, we need to stress that this is not a free-for-all. I'm free, I can do whatever I want. Well, you can, until you infringe on the rights and freedoms of the next person, the person next to you. So if that is the case, then clearly you are doing something that is wrong, illegal, or at the very least unethical. So freedom to do what you wish is perfectly fine, but there are laws that will limit the degree to which you can be free. Now, Rousseau is asking for as much freedom as possible, but is not asking for the right to harm others. That's where it stops, just before. This kind of thinking is actually libertarian. I mean, Rousseau, if he were alive today, would be a member of the Libertarian Party. They wish for minimal government interference, minimal government regulations. That's kind of basically it's small government. That's really what they're looking for. They still wish to have the freedoms and the liberties, of course, libertarian, the liberties to do things, but they too are also well aware that we can't just do anything, right? We have to still follow some kind of rules and regulations. So what kind of moral effect would force have on as a physical power, right? To return to this issue. And Rousseau says this: to yield to force would be an act of necessity or prudence, not a free will, or not even a general will. So if we are forced to do something, there's no choice. We have to do it or we die, right? We do it or we are incarcerated or exiled or whatever. So if we are forced to obey, we have no real obligation to do so because we're not exercising a right? We're just basically trying to survive and live another day so we can fight again. So Rousseau is saying that to yield to force would be an act of necessity, not an act of choice, and certainly not an act of free will. So to be put in a position where you have to yield to force simply because the alternative is imprisonment or death, then morality is gone because there is no choice, right? You cannot make a choice and go, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and do that. Well, your life will be utterly changed in one way or another. Either it will end immediately or you will be incarcerated, at which point issues of freedom and liberty go out the window. So the only way this is going to work for Rousseau is that individuals have to alienate that right. And what that means is to give it up. Alienation sounds like, a disconnect from society, but no, alienation in this sense here means to remove, right? To externalize. So the alienation of each and every person, in other words, they submit to that social contract, they give up the individual rights, and they give it over to the entire community, to the body politic, right? To the general will. So each and every person in the community gives themselves fully, completely to the body politic. We all participate in it 100%. We also get 100% of the benefits, but we need to participate 100% and be social individuals. interact with one another, respect one another. And so this giving up, right, this externalizing and bringing over to somewhere else of these individual rights, it's qualified, right? Each person gives of themselves to all, when in fact, when you think about it, everyone has given themselves up to no one. If everyone does it equally, it's essentially something that is occurring with every single individual. And essentially, it's not affecting any single person. It's not like some people have to give up more than others, right? That's not the case. Okay, so if we have a sovereign that is created as a result of the general will, right, that sovereign cannot hold any interest contrary to the latter. In other words, the monarchy cannot do things that will substantially or irreparably damage the society or the community that sovereign is overseeing. It's counterproductive, right? It's just not a good thing. So sovereign power does not need to give a guarantee to its subjects because it would be impossible for the body to wish to harm its own members. So the sovereign does oversee a group of individuals, but cannot oversee it to the degree where they are going to overpower its citizens and force them to do things that they don't want to do. And so anything that is counterproductive or counterintuitive to the interests of the body politic are considered bad, and they need to be dealt with. So, because when one loses in the social contract, or what we lose may be a natural liberty, but we should have it replaced with a clearly entrenched and protected civil liberty. And that civil liberty is a similar kind of freedom, but it's backed up by enforceable laws. And it's also backed up by a recognition of a lease or a piece of paper or a receipt of some sort that indicates the possession of property that you may have. So that's essentially how it works. So the question comes up, why would duty and interest oblige both parties in a social contract to help each other? Well, that really kind of answers its own question, because if you're going in opposite directions, you're not helping the society. You'll end up tearing it apart. So Rousseau argues that as soon as individuals are united in this way as one body politic, speaking with one voice, expressed through the general will, it becomes impossible to offend one member without also offending all members. And one thing that we have noticed, for example, and I keep talking about the Black Lives Matter movement because it is something occurring right now in front of us. What's happening now, and has been over the summer, is a larger and larger number of basically white Americans are agreeing that, yeah, there's clearly something wrong. The number I think in the summer was around 70% of the population, which of course is everybody, the body politic. So 70% of the body politic in the US believe that the Black Lives Matter movement is legitimate and is worthy of attention and worthy of enacting change for the better. 70%. So that means 30% are arguing that no, it's not. You can imagine who those folks are. I'm going to ignore that phone. But what's happening here is, in certain cases, when there is pushback, we're saying that, okay, if something is harming some people, I should consider it as harming me as well. If the fact that the police are responding to people of color in the U.S. in a certain way, or the indigenous population in Canada, it should offend all of us. And guess what? Every day it seems to offend more and more people, until finally the general will is that do something about it, and do something about it now. And sometimes it can even become an election issue, right? And this is how the general will influences how politicians think. So there is still hope. We have a long way to go. We always have a long way to go. But there is always that possibility that we're getting closer and closer to what is going to make it work. So we can ask ourselves other questions as well. Rousseau, for example, why wouldn't a whole group make itself subject to a king? Well, because it becomes a form of slavery, right? We cannot give over absolutely everything until we have no power. And although we have given up our individual rights, we now are given in exchange civil rights. So those civil rights we need to protect. We need to make sure that we have those protected and entrenched in law, so that if we do disagree with something and the general will which wishes to speak up, we can do so legally. And we'll see that in John Stuart Mill's ideas. So we cannot give ourselves utterly and completely to the king. We give ourselves to the body politic, but to the king or the power, the authority of power, if we do that, we end up as being no better than slaves. And Rousseau believes that someone who does that is merely selling themselves for subsistence. That a person gives him or herself freely is absurd, right? To give yourself freely into slavery, it literally is a contradiction. You cannot freely do that and then end up in slavery. It just doesn't work that way. And for Rousseau specifically, to renounce liberty, natural or civil, right, is to renounce being a human being, right? It's to renounce being an individual and to surrender those rights that were natural and now civil, or even the duties of humanity. So to renounce liberty, which is such a fundamental component of natural right, freedom and happiness are the two main ones. If we give those up, we enter in a kind of a slave state where we are no longer human. Because if we are human, we are free. And if we're not free, we're not human. Now imagine the French in the 1770s reading that going, Zut alors, yeah, right? That's what's happening. They're motivated. It's like, yeah, because they realize to remove all liberty from a person's will is to remove all morality from their acts, all choices that individuals may have to make a decision about something. We don't even have that. So Rousseau, I mean, he sounds like a radical compared to the radical French Enlightenment. He was actually pretty centrist, but it's what his ideas created, what they led to that was revolutionary in literally every sense of the word. So Locke's ideas, the ideas presented by Rousseau, other French thinkers, Voltaire, Diderot, Baron d'Holbach, Helvetius, La Mettrie, all those guys, all kind of essentially were saying the same thing, coming at it from slightly different perspectives, but initially saying the kinds of things that Rousseau was saying, that there is a limit to power, to political power for sure. We need to look at a society not based on theology, but utility, right? What will make the society function more effectively? And will maybe at the same time lessen that kind of superstitious nonsense and, and biases that we have and prejudices that we have. And of course, the way to do it is through education, which becomes a very important component in both Rousseau's thinking and as well as Locke and the other French radical thinkers. So what we have here is a kind of example when in the state of nature, when things are pretty good, we have families that are coming together into communities. And here, when you think of a child, when that child grows up, right, they remain united only voluntarily, right? The family is now not disintegrated, but is withered away because individuals go off to do other things. But they remember that they are part of a family. So no matter where you are, there's always that family tie. And Rousseau talks about how the ruler corresponds to the father. And he says that the father, that the children obey the father. But then the difference is the father then looks out for the child's best interests. And this is why Rousseau uses this as a kind of metaphor, that we are born into this family, or always born somewhere, but we're born into a family, and that family, the head of that family, and it could be today, mother and father, two mothers, two fathers, any configuration, but there will be at least one individual that will look out for the child's best interest. That's how the ruler should be. And that's how the ruler is viewed by Rousseau. So the difference is that the father's love for the children is repaid by the care he takes of them. And in the state, whether it's a monarchy or a prime minister, whatever, that pleasure is replaced by being able to command the citizen subjects in the best way they see fit, but also making sure to take care of them. That's really the most important part, because the father figure needs to be able to know that this particular idea is going to benefit his children and benefit the family at large. And anything that is counterproductive is just going to be counterproductive socially as well. So now we can come back to our little diagram here and take a look at our breaking news and see Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. Now, as I mentioned in the other set of slides, and I think even last week, Rousseau and Locke are essentially the same. The man is essentially good, right? Individuals are essentially good. They are reasonable. Society is what screws us up in the sense that society sometimes constrains us. We live in chains, according to Rousseau. You can take that one, you can take it or leave it, but that's the way he sees it. But individuals are essentially good, and it is the social formations that we create in the institutions that sometimes overstep and overreach the degree to which they wish to control our lives. And Rousseau wishes to keep this at an absolute minimum. And this is why he is considered a libertarian, because he wishes government to just back off a little bit. And for him, government, right, is needed to enforce a social contract, and that's it. That's as far as they need to go. Government should be, he says that they should be arbitrary. It's like conditional, but again, as a libertarian, you wish to have a minimal amount of government, as little government interference in your daily life as possible. And like Locke, it can be overthrown. And also that power should be shared. Now, the difference with Rousseau, because he was born and raised in Vienna, Vienna was a very small city. I mean, it isn't now, but at the time he wrote, it was a small city. And Rousseau, along with other thinkers, were really enamored by the notion of ancient Greece and the ancient polis, right, in Athens. And there, in Athens, we had what was called direct democracy. And this meant that there were no politicians that spoke on behalf of individuals. Individuals themselves got together, and there might be, let's say in Athens, the belief was that there was about 400 or 500 individuals who were of course male, who were propertied. In other words, they owned property, and they were the ones that sat around together and discussed and debated laws. And they too posited laws. And Rousseau thought this was a wonderful, a wonderful model for direct democracy in Europe. Now, clearly that's not possible simply because of the number of people, the sheer number of individuals that make up the body politic. But he wished to have a direct response and direct interaction, right? Conversations and dialogues with government officials or with government as possible. So he based this idea of the interaction between the body politic and government institutions without, in a sense, a middleman, right? Like the middleman in this case being the politician. He wished to do away with the political structure in that sense, still wish to have a political structure, but we are now involved in a kind of direct democracy. But clearly that cannot work because of the population. So it was a wonderful idea at the time, but clearly that has never happened since ancient Athens, because now by the time we come back, we have such a larger population that democracy with elected officials, like what we see in Locke, becomes the order of the day. So that really becomes a much better way to conduct political business. So that is Rousseau in a nutshell. And now we're going to take a look at John Stuart Mill. And we're going to go through Mill rather quickly because what I wanted to do is to kind of pose questions and then see if we could answer them. And the answers, of course, will give us some of the main clues as to where Mill sits in terms of the social contract, political structures, social institutions, and so on. So the first question is, what is John Stuart Mill's principle of liberty? And the answer is, we have a right to do whatever we choose as long as it does not unjustifiably harm others. I'll explain to you in question 5 what unjustifiably means. So we have a right to do whatever we choose as long as it does not harm others. So Mill, more or less like Rousseau, a bit of a libertarian, says no government or individual may restrict our liberty unless the restriction can be justified on utilitarian grounds of promoting the well-being of the greatest numbers. So others may try to influence us, but they may not force us to do what they wish. The only exception he makes is with a utilitarian perspective of the greater good of society. So this is where Mill kind of lays down, he draws a line in the sand, right? We'll use that metaphor. He draws a line in the sand by saying, you're free to do whatever you want until you begin to harm other people. But if your behavior is in itself harmful, the state, operating from a utilitarian perspective, reserve the right to curtail your activities. Let's say, you really love to listen to metal, right? And you just want to hear it all day long. And you're playing that music till 2 o'clock in the morning. Well, I can do whatever I want. I'm not hurting anybody. Yeah, but no one can sleep. And hey, I'm not picking that because I hate metal. I don't. I love it. All kinds. But The point is, we got to get some sleep, right? Like, stop playing so much loud music. And Mill says that we reserve the right to enjoy things, but once it infringes on others, it may not be illegal, but we now have bylaws that say, that state clearly, no noise, no excessive noise after 11. People have to sleep. So whatever you're doing, 11 o'clock, done. So this is what he means where, from a utilitarian perspective, because people have to sleep, most people work, right? We need to curtail the noise by 11 o'clock. So until then, you can have all the fun you want, listen to all the music you want and whatever else. But it isn't just music. It's home renovations. It's, house parties. Anything that will disrupt another person's sleep late at night, there is a bylaw against it. Question 2. What 3 areas does Mill specify as appropriate regions of human liberty? And this is the one that the first time I taught it, I sort of glossed over it very quickly. But let's be honest here. The last 4 years have been really insane. And insane to the degree where the ideas that are presented to us by Mill are now being contested. And laws and bylaws are being introduced by politicians to curtail these different things. So the question is, what are these 3 areas of liberty that Mill finds to be so important? The 3 are liberty of consciousness, liberty of taste and pursuit, and liberty to assemble. So liberty of consciousness means liberty of thoughts and feelings. Also the ability to express a thought, right? In writing or out loud. We also have liberty of taste and pursuit, so that we're not, the same conforming individuals. We all look the same, we think the same, we act the same. It gets boring, right? It really kind of gets boring. We should frame our lives around what we consider important. And, the way we dress and the way we cut our hair, or, what color we have it, these things should allow individuals to express who they are. So liberty of taste and pursuits. And finally, and this is the one that is, of course, been pushed back from government officials, is liberty to assemble, right? Freedom of assembly. Freedom to unite for any purpose not involving harm to others. We're not going to get a lynch mob together to hang somebody because we think we know who did wrong. No, this is to unite for a political purpose, to have a spontaneous demonstration or protest of some sort. This is what Mill believes to be really important and should be entrenched in law. We should have this protected. Now, the second one that we just looked at here, and we talked about the second one, freedom of taste and pursuits, my mistake. Number 1, liberty of consciousness here. This leads into question 3. According to Mill, how does freedom of thought and expression contribute to the well-being of society? And this is something that we hopefully can get this thing back on track. And it has a lot to do with, first of all, it's built on respect, right? Respecting that other person's opinion and listening to what they have to say. We're at a point now that doing this is very difficult because all we're doing is screaming past each other. We seem to have entrenched views about whether or not to wear masks or whether or not to vote for this or that person. But Mill says, if you wish liberty to continue and not be threatened, here's what I propose we do. He says, I propose that we allow for dissent, right? Dissent is disobedience and disagreement. That's what he means by dissent. So dissent, Mill believes that it's really useful for the following 4 reasons. First of all, an opinion is worth hearing. That should shock some people, like, what? This guy's an idiot. No. Mill believes that an opinion is worth hearing. And here's why. Even an erroneous opinion, even a wrong opinion, a stupid opinion, an ignorant opinion may contain a grain of truth. Possibly. Doesn't say they all do, but if we can hear it, it might be, questionable, but he says we should at least hear it, which leads to the third idea. An opinion can be vigorously contested in order to expose its prejudices or irrationality. So it's at this point now that we need to have healthy debate. So the second we need to hold on to, as much as we may say, I totally disagree with this person, let's just hold off. Let's see if we can find that grain of truth. So we go to the third step, that if we can at least debate honestly, we can either, unveil the prejudice and bias and irrationality of an idea and go, Here's why it's wrong. And then Mill says, no, that's what we want to do. We want to be able to have healthy debate. Because the fourth idea, discussion or debate will either confirm the status quo is correct, that in fact respecting individuals is a good thing, not arbitrarily killing people because of the color of the skin is a bad thing, on and on. Or if that person, however bizarre the opinion may be at a certain point, then it might invite us to reconsider that previously held opinion about ourselves, right? So the status quo will now be questioned, and we will now have a chance to debate more vigorously in a more healthy way ideas that may at first been considered unusual, we'll say, but it has to be done under sort of a level of respect, because if we're just going to listen and just go, you're wrong, or fake news, or I'm going to go on YouTube and do some research, no, it's going to take a little more than that. So Mill says at least hear the person out and then debate it. But of course, both sides have to be respecting each other. And that's kind of what we don't have. People are too busy screaming past each other. So question 4. Assess Mill's claim that the expression of individuality is one of the principal ingredients of human happiness. And Mill believes that diversity, right, the freedom of individuals to express themselves, is one of the components of social formations that is very, very healthy. Because if people can express themselves, then the degree of human happiness is going to be there. People are happy. They can do what they like to do. So that is considered very, very important. So if that's the case, the ability of society to progress forward is also going to happen. And not only that, but human life itself, right? Human existence will be richer and more diversified when people are doing things that they do like, or a whole range of things, right? Let's say the one night you play metal, the next night you go to the opera, the next day you go to a monster truck rally, or whatever you want to do. That's why there are so many different things we can do that we can find entertaining, because we're allowing people to express themselves. And if we can do that, it will lead to a degree of human happiness that is measurable and worthwhile. Now, question number 5, this relates back to the first question about cannot, unjustifiably stop someone from doing something. And the question is this: is Mill's position that we cannot force someone to do something because it will make him or her happy consistent with the theory of utilitarianism? And for Mills, he says, yes, on the one hand, we cannot force individuals or compel them to do something that they don't want to do. But there are exceptions, and the exception is this: the only reason why power can be rightfully exercised over a member of a civilized community or a society is to prevent them from harming others. So you can be doing things that you find pleasurable, and generally speaking, it's not harming anyone else, maybe yourself, depends what it is. But if it is harming the general population, right, the body politic, the general will, once those things begin to happen, then utilitarians reserve the right to curtail your activities, we'll say. And so that's how Mill is able to reconcile being both a utilitarian and a kind of libertarian with minimal government interference, minimal regulations, but those regulations still need to be for the betterment of society. Anything that is not so is considered counterintuitive and counterproductive. So key points here for Rousseau: force does not give a government moral authority. Civil authority arises out of what is called a social contract. It grows out of that agreement. Individuals, they were originally in a state of nature, in complete freedom. We need to make sure that we hold on to that. And self-preservation is the reason why, right, the difficulty in self-preservation and maintaining it becomes the reason why individuals come together in this contract, engage with one another in compacts, and create eventually a body politic that as one large voice expresses itself as the general will. Now, in terms of the control that we have over that, so it's not we, but the government has over the body politic, force can be a physical power, but if we have to yield to it as an act of necessity, it's no longer moral, because we have no free will. If we are forced to do something, then it means that we're just doing it just to survive, or you're doing it out of necessity. And so by the same token, an individual who becomes a slave of another or gives of themselves 100%, including their civil rights, is selling themselves completely and becoming an unhuman person. So to renounce liberty, which is a human attribute, is part of our natural right, to give that up means surrendering that right and even the duties of being a human being in the first place. So when we get together, what do? Right? We unite. And once we do that, we are thinking and acting as one person, as one body politic. So any harm that comes to one should be considered harm coming to all. And we're seeing this, like I said, an example. The increasing number of people believe that the Black Lives Matter movement is legitimate and worthy of serious consideration and also legal changes. And in the same way as, defunding the police, we don't do away with the police. We now hire, social workers and PSWs and psychologists, people that can diffuse situations. This is where the body politic is expressing something that is of great concern to them. And then in turn, we're able to see laws being changed. Now, they haven't yet, but it's on the table. And politicians need to address this because if they wish to stay in power, they better listen to the general will. Key points on Mill. The principle of liberty is that we have a right to do whatever we choose as long as it does not unjustifiably harm others. And so we are only sovereign unto ourselves, but we now are going to have our activities curtailed if we do end up harming others. So no government or individuals should restrict our liberty unless they are justified on utilitarian grounds, which is what Mill believes to be still correct. It's not harming individuals, it's curtailing them and stopping them from doing things that will simply be, antisocial at the very least. There's three regions of human liberty that Mill thinks is important. Liberty of consciousness, thought, and feelings, liberty of taste and pursuit, and the freedom to unite, freedom of assembly is what we call it. Those three things are very, very important. And of the first one, liberty of thought and expression is important because Mill believes that an opinion is worth hearing, even if it sounds bizarre or racist or something. We need to at least listen to it because there could be a grain of truth, a little bit. And I'm not saying every one of them does, but unless we discuss them honestly and openly, we won't be able to find that grain of truth. And there may not be one. Instead, it's a hateful, prejudicial, horrible idea, and it is discussed as such and dismissed. And if we can discuss openly in a respectful debate, we might be able to find out that, you know what, society is perfectly fine the way it is. This is a stupid idea. Or, I never thought about this. Let's say, the 1800s. What do you mean slavery is wrong? I never thought of it that way. How come? Somebody had to ask that question. So, like, whether it's Rousseau or others, someone had to ask that question because the consensus was slavery is just an economic thing. It's just, buying and selling individuals to do work. That's all it is. Without ever stopping to think about their human freedom, their personhood, their autonomy, their what about their natural rights? And so you present this otherwise bizarre idea, slavery is wrong in the 1700s. That opinion was not shared by a lot of people. And you persist, and you finally identify the grain of truth, which is, it is not only horrible, but it defies everything that is what every philosopher has ever said about natural rights. That's not what it's about. Oh, maybe we should do something about it. So that's why Mill thinks that this is important. However odd that opinion may be at that time, it's worth discussing because there's something we may be able to learn as a result of it. So that's essentially John Stuart Mill in the second half, and the first half, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. We'll talk about it in a little bit more detail. You've certainly raised some questions if you like when we meet on either Wednesday or Thursday. But in the meantime, we'll just pack this up and I will see you real soon.